All right, let's give this a go. This is test number 2 of the day to see if I can figure out this live streaming thing and do it properly for you guys. Right now, I am trying to figure out how to share this video to social media so people can actually watch it. So I'm just going to wait a second for more people to pile in here into the live stream. Hey Tyrell, there are some people here already. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer. Just bear with me, guys. Okay, there's a few people in here, which is cool. So give me about a minute, guys. Just queuing something up here. Almost ready. 3, 2. Okay, cool. All right. Almost. Give me a second. Okay, so the way I'm doing this, I'm not going to be looking directly at the super chat or whatever the fuck it's called window the whole time while I'm doing this YouTube stream. I will be checking it occasionally because I'm not streaming directly to YouTube. Basically, guys, I still have a lot to work out and work through with how to do these goddamn live streams. Too bad I wasn't born a generation earlier and knew exactly what I was doing, and could provide the right level of clickbait titling and keywords for you guys too. But this video will probably sort of die in obscurity. But there's a very small amount of people who actually are interested in what I have to say about this. So I figured that I would do this today because Twitter is a pretty bad forum to actually have like real debates with people and have substantive discussions. And that's where I tend to provoke most of the, I guess, anger and annoyance when I tweet things that are seemingly controversial to people about Tulsi Gabbard. This is something that has provoked quite a angry response from people, a lot of my own followers. In a similar way to when I go after people like Tucker Carlson or even Caitlyn Johnstone of the past. just wanted to start this discussion by explaining that I'm not a neoliberal. I'm not a Hillary supporter. I'm also not a Bernie supporter. I am very far to the left. And when it comes to foreign policy, I have held the same views pretty much since 2003, maybe with a little differences here and there. When I see people being hoisted up to the position of most anti-war person on TV or most anti-war person, running in the presidential race, that is right in my wheelhouse. When I hear that phrase, I'm like, oh, great. Someone speaking out on the values that I hold dear, that are the most important to me. So this is pretty much how I was introduced to the new version of Tucker Carlson, and how I was introduced to Tulsi Gabbard as a politician. People following me know that I have pretty high standards on the issue of anti-war. A lot of people accuse me of doing a purity test when I bring this issue up. But I think it's extremely important to really explain why, fundamentally, any rhetoric that promotes the framework of the war on terror needs to be fought and combated against at every single turn, with no exceptions. Even if you really like a politician or a figurehead that is espousing certain foreign policy views that you really like, if you are a consistent anti-war person and you hold these beliefs, you should automatically also reject the premise of the war on terror. And you should also understand that you cannot decouple, you cannot separate the idea of a regime change war from what is now known as the war on terror. And this is something, interestingly, that Tulsi Gabbard has made a very specific distinction on in her rhetoric. She doesn't say that she's against the wars. You'll notice that she actually never really says that in a general sense. She is against the regime change wars, she says. Now, interestingly, in an interview with Joe Rogan that I'm going to play some clips of a little later, she actually fully understands, that the Iraq war was sold to the American public as part of the larger war on terror, which is a fake construct. In fact, both of the regime change wars, quote-unquote regime change wars, that followed immediately after 9/11 were both sold to us as part of the war on terror. So I need to start this discussion by saying that you cannot decouple the two from one another. You can maybe make the argument that certain specific war maneuvering, like in Venezuela, is very overtly a regime change war. However, you also cannot completely separate the idea of the war on terror from that. Because as we see, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, and other people in Trump's administration are actually trying to spike that narrative by saying that Hezbollah and Iran and different terrorist groups are sort of holding out in Venezuela. So this is all mixed together. Even when a war is proposed as an overt regime change war, you'll notice that government officials always have to spike it with something having to do with the war on terror, the Bush-era war on terror paradigm. Because essentially that is the fuel. The fear-mongering that was done after 9/11 is the fuel that feeds into the idea that regime change or any war after 9/11 is acceptable, or especially preemptive war. So I feel that her reductive rhetoric in regards to regime change wars and how we need to stop those specifically is a gross oversimplification, and it seems deliberately narrow in order to appeal to both the left and the right side of the spectrum. And I'll say that one more time. I'm not saying that Tulsi Gabbard is some kind of plant stealth right-winger, being hoisted into the left anti-imperialist, anti-war movement to poison it from the inside. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that she seems to be broadly molding her anti-war rhetoric in such a way to appeal to a very broad voting base on the left and the right that appears to be trying to even broaden the rhetoric even more than someone who's very much on the right, like Rand Paul. And I find that troubling, that when I've heard Rand Paul talk about war, especially in the past, he's gotten actually pretty bad. He's bootlicked Trump to an extraordinary degree in the last year that has significantly weakened his anti-war rhetoric. He's talking about declaring victory in Afghanistan, and that's what we need to do, which is a completely bullshit premise. There is no victory to be had in that war. And even if there was, it's irrelevant to us believing or not. So it is true, and this is something I'll stand by, is that Ron Paul, a libertarian Republican, has actually proposed and said things rhetorically against war that are far stronger than what Tulsi Gabbard is saying right now in her presidential campaign. So that's also interesting to me, that she has broadened and sort of molded an anti-war message to be, I guess, more broadly appealing than even the Ron Paul rhetoric of the 2012 campaign, or I forgot the last time he ran, if it was 2012, 2008. And yes, someone in the YouTube chat just said something that, again, Tulsi Gabbard does not bring up, that people like Ron Paul and even Rand Paul have brought up, which is, and if she has brought this up, let me just also mention this. If I'm saying anything that's incorrect, that you feel is factually incorrect, or that is cherry picking, or that is hyperbolic, or that is even unfair about Tulsi Gabbard, please say so in the chat. I don't want to talk out of school, and I don't want to smear her or mischaracterize her positions. I really do not. I've already been accused of doing that, and part of the reason I want to make this live stream is to clear that up and actually explain in detail why I have such serious problems with her. But in the YouTube chat, a guy named Rhizome just said, outside of, quote, active wars, there are also the hundreds of military bases overseas, the continual threat of war. This is something that I believe needs to be included in a strong anti-war, anti-imperialism position. And it is something that I don't even know necessarily if she's capable of doing that, because one other thing that I think people ignore is that she is active duty currently in the National Guard. So I don't know technically how much that limits her from what she's actually able to say against the military specifically, but I would be willing to bet that it might even limit her in like a specific legal sense. Like I actually don't know what you're not allowed to say if you're active duty serving in the military. I believe there are some specific rules having to do with that. That aside, the mentality of still serving actively in the military also probably prevents her on some level from having a stronger anti-war position. And I don't even just mean her rhetoric, like being able to go out there and have stronger rhetoric. I mean her actual position might even be influenced by the fact that she is loyal to the U.S. military. That is speculation. I don't know, what the rules are in the military. I don't know what mindset might be preventing her from taking a stronger stance, but those both need to be explored, I think. And there's a lot of other issues with her that I think other people are finding strange as well. One issue in particular is why she seems unwilling to go after Israel. Or if she does, it's pretty lightly, or she usually dodges the issue. For example, and this unfortunately is going to be the only clip that I don't have queued up and ready to go for you guys. Which kind of sucks, because part of the reason I'm doing this broadcast is it a response to Michael Tracy saying that I was misrepresenting her views. In an interview with Michael Tracy that she conducted, I think maybe last month, Tulsi was asked about Israel, and she says she specifically doesn't like to single out other countries. But yet, in the same interview and other interviews, she goes extremely strongly against Saudi Arabia, very specifically. So I find that interesting. There is a contradiction there where her stated reasons for not going after Israel don't hold up to scrutiny according to some of her other positions on Saudi Arabia. So that feels like, to me, her wiggling out of that one. She's choosing to go hard after Saudi Arabia. She's very much choosing to be soft on Israel. I'm not going to say why that is, but that remains true. And it doesn't really hold up her reasons for not going after Israel, because we've seen her go very hard against Saudi Arabia. And I guess, there are other things that I think need to be addressed. Someone just brought up a very common thing that I hear on Twitter all the time when I bring this up about her. Someone named Aman, I think I'm pronouncing that wrong, says, who's the better anti-war candidate? And I'll get on board. I just don't see any. I don't know. I'm not here to argue who to vote for. I'm not in the business anymore of propping up politicians or telling people who to vote for instead of a certain other politician. I usually personally vote third party. It's not normal for me to vote in a Democratic primary in general, or even a primary for a Republican or a Democrat. It's not something I traditionally do. So if you're wanting me to advocate for someone who's stronger on anti-war, I mean, I could guarantee you that there will be several third-party candidates running in the general election in 2020 that will have far stronger positions on war than Tulsi Gabbard. I can absolutely guarantee you that. There's no question of that. If you're asking me what Democrats are stronger on war, none. I mean, they're all bad on war. And I would argue even Tulsi Gabbard is bad on war. She has some serious problems with her anti-war rhetoric, which I'm going to go into in pretty explicit detail on the stream. So it's interesting, that we're back in this paradigm of lesser of two evils. It's like, because I'm criticizing Tulsi Gabbard, I'm constantly asked, who's better? She's the best, and it's like, I just don't subscribe to that paradigm. I'm perfectly, I guess I'm surprised that it's not more accepted to have people voice good faith arguments as to why Tulsi Gabbard's, some of her anti-war rhetoric has problems and needs to be a lot better. I am surprised that so many people are so defensive of that and don't really want to hear that. Because from my perspective, let's just say if she's aware of these criticisms and she takes them seriously, then she'll be a stronger political candidate in the debates. And I'm going to go through, just a couple examples to start of what I see as two of her primary problems in delivering this anti-war message, and why her position right now going into the debates is actually fairly weak, because nobody, including two semi-adversarial journalists who pressed her on some of these issues, has actually gotten her to reflect what I believe to be an acceptable position on these two crucial issues. Glenn Greenwald tried. Jordan Chariton tried. I commend them both for their efforts in trying to get her to answer this question differently. They kind of even softballed her. They both kind of were like almost handing her the right answer, if you know what I mean. And in both examples, she kind of didn't take it. And in one example, the interview with Glenn Greenwald, she actually doubled down on her position on why she believes in the war on terror. So before I start playing those clips, let me just address some of the comments in the chat, because I've seen some of them piled up. I'm just trying to see if there's anything in here I haven't addressed. Okay, James Bishop brings up something that a lot of other people have brought up to me. He says, some genuinely just want to fight Wahhabi terrorism with force. Others use it as an excuse for empire expansion war profiteering. No, Tulsi is in the former camp. Well, first of all, I mean, I think it's a childlike and very oversimplified view, and honestly one that is informed by post 9/11 fear-mongering and Bush-era neoconservative propaganda, to believe that anyone, including the military, including anyone, can fight a tactic, can fight terror. It's an illogical premise. Terrorism is a tactic. It doesn't matter really what ideology it comes from. A lot of this traditional, what people describe as terrorism, is designed to be unpreventable, unbeatable, meaning that it's designed to hit soft targets. A lot of these terrorist acts are, like the most recent one in Sri Lanka was done while people were in church. There's really nothing you could do to prevent something like that from happening. I don't really understand this notion that you can just fight your way out of people performing terrorist acts or people believing what ideology they want to believe. I don't understand that premise, and I really don't think there is any logic behind it. I think the only quote-unquote logic behind it is propaganda that we've been fed after 9/11. So, as Rhizome says, he says, reclaim your pre-9/11 mindset. Absolutely 100%. We need to get the fuck out of this brainwashed mindset forever and stop believing that there's any legitimacy whatsoever to the war on terror. Because if we can't get out of just that simple paradigm, we're screwed. We're not going to stop war. We're not going to convince people to stop war. I know that it's been a long time since 9/11 and people feel that it's completely pointless to try to do that. But I'm sorry, I do not subscribe to a false reality that was constructed for us by the Bush administration. I also don't subscribe to the false reality that all evil emanates from Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism, and that needs to be defeated or combated. I think that's complete horse shit. I think the real evil in this world that needs to be defeated and combated is American hegemony, the imperialist, narcissistic mindset that Americans have, to me, is far more dangerous than any Wahhabism, ISIS, any of these groups combined. So, I mean, if you find that offensive, if you don't agree with that, I mean, I don't really know why you're even watching this. I'm trying to appeal to people that remember what it was like before 9/11, that remember what it was like before we were brainwashed into oblivion to think that there are Arabs and Muslims hiding around every corner waiting to kill us. And just look at the logic of, even this premise that ISIS and Al-Qaeda poses a threat to the United States. It's illogical. I mean, just look at the statistics of how many quote-unquote attacks have happened on American soil that were claimed to have been done by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I mean, very few. If you want to look at 9/11 specifically, I don't believe Al-Qaeda attacked us by themselves on 9/11 and it was an Al-Qaeda attack that killed 3,000 people. That's what the Bush administration told us. That's what the mainstream media told us. And even this notion that Saudi Arabia somehow is behind 9/11 because of what came out in the 28 pages is also bullshit. We know that the Bush administration pretty much did everything in their power to ignore the warnings and to also cover up the investigation. So to me, if you're an American and you're concerned about war and stopping war, that should be your primary focus, not what Saudi, what do we do to protect Saudi Arabia? How many of the hijackers were Saudi versus other nationalities? To me, that's all irrelevant if you're not tackling the idea that the Bush administration, by all accounts, did everything in their power to allow these attacks to take place, and then additionally covered them up so that we'd never really learn the truth about them. So if that's your premise for wanting to wage a war on terror or wanting to kill terrorists, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I wish you would go back and question the event itself a little deeper. Um, you know, there's I really do not think anything besides really looking into 9/11 and how we're lied to about that will save us completely from subscribing to this war on terror paradigm. So just wanted to get that out of the way as well. Let's see. Just more. Let me look at more of these comments. Yeah, Slow News Day has a great point. I mean, he says, it amazes me that in 2019, most people know the news and government is full of shit. But for whatever reason, the one time Bush told the unvarnished truth was about 9/11. I mean, that's an interesting statement. It's interesting too, because like most neoliberal, like wishy-washy established journalists on the left will admit that the Bush administration lied about 9/11. They will admit that the 9/11 Commission didn't tell us the full truth when you press them on it, like Matt Taibbi. But they won't go any further than that. They won't actually want to have a serious discussion about what that actually means and the depth of how the Bush administration actually lied. To me, it's kind of a pathetic, cowardly concession to just move on. Be like, yeah, they lied, they covered it up, but, it's the Bush administration. Like, that doesn't mean it was an inside job or whatever. It's like, well, then you're just putting the cart before the horse. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we were deeply lied to about the fundamental narrative that has created this endless war on terror. So that's, to me, that's really all you need to say. You don't need to go into any of the sort of the conspiracies or, the 9/11 truth talking points to logically argue against this. Marlon Edinger says, "Hey Robbie, I want to talk about the bumbling empire theory which Gabbard subscribes to 1,000,000,000%." I'm not 100% sure what that means. So Marlon, if you want to elaborate on that a little bit in the chat, feel free to do that. I mean, if I get what you're saying, that she thinks that like the empire is just sort of stumbling into these wars and that they're mistakes. I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit there because in the process of doing this live stream, when I watched her on Joe Rogan, I was actually surprised how much she sort of subscribed to the idea that the military industrial complex is driving these wars for profits. And I was impressed by her rhetoric in that area. So this podcast isn't just going to be tearing her down or picking apart her rhetoric. It's going to be also being like, hey, this is something great that she said in this specific area. And I wish she would say more about this. I wish other people would say more about this. So I will play some stuff like that. So Marlon clarified what he meant a little bit. He says that she's kind of saying we should pursue war smartly. Yeah, I could see that she subscribes a little bit to that paradigm. Well, no, I know you're right. Not just a little bit. She does subscribe to that a lot because she does make this distinction between regime change wars and just war and wars conducted in the war on terror. So to me, that is kind of another way of saying smart wars versus dumb wars. She's just not actually using that exact Obama-like rhetoric. But she is finding another way to kind of say it. So I see what you're saying there, Marlon. I agree with that. So first I'm going to play, and I don't have the video of this, so I hope you guys don't mind just audio. I'm not editing these clips at all. This is just me queuing up parts, what I believe to be two of her strongest weaknesses, her biggest weaknesses when it comes to hoisting herself up as an anti-war candidate. And making that her main platform and making foreign policy her main platform. So here's an interview she did with Status Quo. This is Jordan Chariton's imprint. It was conducted on February 24th, 2019. And he was the first person, to my knowledge, to, in a good faith way, challenge her a little bit on some of her problematic statements. He did hand her a lot of softballs throughout the course of the interview that she kind of didn't take, and she answered, I believe, sort of incorrectly or differently than Jordan was maybe hoping she would answer. But here's the main one. I mean, and this is the main one that's, that was an instant deal breaker for me. Because in 2014, I believe that if you were in office back then and you had a wishy-washy position on torture, that essentially makes you like a neocon. I mean, unless you unequivocally denounce torture in every form, to me, that kind of makes you a neocon. And that's why I was calling Sam Harris a neocon back then, because he was trying to articulate a similar position about a ticking time bomb or whatever. So here's what Jordan Chariton has to say about this interview that Tulsi Gabbard conducted in 2014, where she was asked what she thought about the release of the CIA torture report. In the interview, she wasn't just asked what she thought of the report, the content of the report. She was also asked by the interviewer just a general question about torture. That, well, a lot of people say that torture doesn't even work. So why would we do it? I'm paraphrasing her. Tulsi kind of takes a wishy-washy position even with that. She says that, well, some people, say that it works and some people say that it doesn't work. And it's just like, wow, that's 2014. That's pretty late in the game. I guess I assume that most people who held the views that she had were, had already learned that torture was, we were basically brainwashed and fear-mongered into accepting this premise of torture. And that, even if it worked, that's an irrelevant argument. And we already know, of course it doesn't work. Anyone would say anything under duress to make it stop. So here, I'm going to play you the clip of Jordan Chariton asking her to clarify her position on this from this 2014 interview.
Okay. And I wanted to also ask you about, in 2014, I think you were on a program in India, and as far as torture, you kind of, you said you were torn. This was in response to the Senate torture report, kind of talking about, well, if we had intelligence that within 24 hours a nuclear bomb was going to explode. I'll be honest, it did come off a little wish-washy to me. I'd love your thoughts on, you either have one camp that says torture in any form is just wrong, but also ineffective. So as president, would you, unequivocally rule it out? And if so, what changed from 2014?
Yeah. That report had literally just come out. I hadn't had time to look at it and to read it when that interview was taking place. Obviously have since. And through my time on the Armed Services Committee in Congress over the last 5 years.
Sorry, guys. Just was told my mic cut out there. Okay, going back to what I was saying. What Jordan did in his question, I feel like actually maybe there's some people out there who haven't seen this video, so I feel like I should play it, because if I'm playing you Jordan questioning her about torture, then you might as well hear the original interview. So I kind of did this in the wrong order. So I'm just going to play you a little bit of her original interview now about torture, because I think this is, to me, one of the most glaring standout things that needs to be seriously addressed, and needs to be addressed in much more thorough detail than she's done so far. Now I'm having a hell of a time finding this video of her talking about torture. Someone want to link? Can someone link me to that video if they know? Oh, so you didn't hear the video either. Did you hear it at all, Jenny? Did you hear the audio at all from the video? Or was it just really low? Okay, I'll jack up the volume all the way for the video, and I'll watch when you okay. Okay. How's my mic, just my mic level right now? Is it okay? Okay, that was my fault. I muted my mic thinking that there would be echo when I played back the video clip, but you know what? Fuck it. If there's echo, it'll be better than me going on mute again by accident. So, I'm assuming that's Jason in the chat. Thanks. Yeah, no, I do need your advice. You have this shit dialed in, and I need to figure out how to do this better. So I am still looking for the actual original interview where Tulsi Gabbard talks about torture. And I'm not finding it. Okay. Here's the interview. 1751. Okay, David just linked me.
Tulsi Gabbard's Twitter page introduces you to a...
Okay, I gotta cue this up. Give me a second.
Introduces you to a...
Okay, I gotta cue this up. Give me a second. Okay, I think I queued this up to the right place. Let me know if the audio on this is good. This is an interview from 2014, 12/17/2014. I think it's from an Indian television channel called Aloha India. Here we go.
How do you respond to the much discussed report on the CIA's use of torture and what some Americans have called a blot on American values? Do you share that opinion, or as a soldier do you have a very different perspective on the use of torture?
Very bluntly, I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted on this report. There are, I think the jury is still out on the report itself. There have been comments that there are things missing or it was incomplete, and there are differing opinions on the report itself. But as I think about it myself, clearly we would not like to see any human, any person around the world being treated inhumanely. On the other side, I can also understand that any of us, if we're in a situation where our family or our community, our state or our country
Absurd.
is in a place where, let's say in an hour,
Oh
a
my
nuclear
God.
bomb or an attack will go off unless
cringe.
this information is
This is
found.
horrific.
I believe that if I were the president of the United States, that I would do everything in my power to keep the American people safe. So this is an area that I have conflicting feelings on.
Although, of
Yikes.
course, there are questions about whether torture actually leads to the correct intel,
Softball.
right? That debate carries on.
That debate carries on. There are those who are in the position of conducting these interrogations, some who have said
It does work.
it does, and others who have said it doesn't.
This is
All right,
insane.
before we let you go, what is the one thing you're
Okay,
looking
so, I
forward
mean, I
to
don't know if
really
you
doing in
noticed
India? We
there-
saw you tweeted some pictures of a mango sorbet.
Sorry about that. I don't know if you noticed there. I mean, again, it seems like there's some of these interviewers who are just like, you know, that's in my book a softball question that the interviewer kind of handed her. Well, a lot of people say this is ineffective, and she answers, well, yeah, some people who do these interrogations say it's effective. Some people say it's not effective. I'm just surprised because I would normally a politician would sort of read the room a little better than that and know that she was kind of being handed a softball that she didn't take. She answered the question completely crazily. And not just that, but that her job as president would be to keep the American people safe. And the example she gives is a 24 fictional ticking time bomb scenario that's never happened in the history of, you know, like a foreign policy or anything. That is an imaginary scenario that, frankly, in 2014, if you would believe in a scenario like that enough to repeat it on TV in 2014, I mean, that is crazy. I honestly do not know how to make heads or tails of that. That is really crazy. I mean, that's 6 years out of the Bush administration. That someone could still believe something like that is honestly shocking. For someone who isn't a self-proclaimed neocon. So that's just alone, to me, that was like the deal breaker moment where I was like, oh my God, I cannot prop up this candidate. I cannot support her unless she does a complete about face, a thorough breakdown of how deeply wrong she was in 2014, why she felt so wrong in 2014, and how kind of regretful she was for saying something so crazy in 2014 about torture. She hasn't really done that at all. And the closest thing I can find is this Jordan Chariton interview where he asks her, and he also gives her a softball or an out, whatever you want to call it, in the interview. And he does her the favor of sort of mashing up both of her answers into one question, which I thought was a mistake because it gives her the opportunity to essentially wiggle out of it by saying that, oh, she couldn't really comment appropriately on the torture report because it had just come out and she didn't have enough time to see it. That's a real dodge. And here you'll hear her do it right here. I'm going to play you the start of his question a little more since I kind of backtracked from there.
You said you were torn. This was in response to the Senate torture report, kind of talking about, well, if we had intelligence that within 24 hours a nuclear bomb was going to explode. I'll be honest, it did come off a little wish-washy to me. I'd love your thoughts on, it's
a little wishy-washy. He was being very kind there. I mean, I know Jordan's content well enough to know that he didn't just think it was a little wishy-washy. So let's continue.
The one camp that says torture in any form is just wrong, but also ineffective. So as president, would you, unequivocally rule it out? And if so, what changed from 2014?
That report had literally just come out. I hadn't had time to look at it and to read it when that interview was taking place.
Fail. That was a terrible, terrible answer. Now remember, this interview is from 2019. This is her opportunity to clarify her position on torture with adversarial independent media that tends to lean, very anti-war, very anti-U.S. intervention, to Jordan's credit. This was her opportunity to do that. And her first answer was that she didn't get enough time to read the report. That's a huge fail of an answer. Huge. Let's continue.
Obviously have since, and through my time on the Armed Services Committee in Congress over the last 5 years, I've supported amendments to the defense bill that ban torture, ban these enhanced interrogation techniques, and as president will continue to strongly oppose torture and the use of those techniques.
She even seems to want to use the term enhanced interrogation techniques as if it's a legitimate term. Notice she doesn't say, as some people refer to them, as enhanced interrogation techniques, but what they really are is torture. Notice she doesn't say anything like that. And this is her opportunity to clarify her crazy, inappropriate answer on the torture question. So let me keep playing.
Mm-hmm. Wanted to ask you about, just in general, we have 70% want Medicare for all.
So if you notice, that was her opportunity to clarify her position. That was Jordan's opportunity to press her on that position. And he essentially lets her completely wiggle out of the question. I mean, no follow-up, and that was it. As far as I know, as far as I'm aware, that is her best response on the issue. And that's very, very problematic for a candidate going out there now on a platform of peace and anti-war. Someone else, Glenn Greenwald, someone else with access to her, who's not afraid to press her on these issues, needs to do it. And unfortunately, Glenn, in a Twitter interchange I had with him, claimed that he had an interview coming out with her where he talked about all that stuff, he said, directly to me in a tweet. Apparently, Glenn was wrong, that he either cut out the section of the interview where he talked to her about that, or he didn't see my tweet where I told him that she needs to be pressed harder on the issue of torture, and only maybe saw my other tweet. Luckily, though, he did press her on another issue. The infamous phrase, as he puts it, about her being a hawk on the war on terror, but a dove on regime change wars. This is what he actually ended up pressing her on in the interview. And I don't know if it was just a matter of time or what, but the interview ends like right after, without really any follow-up at all. And I frankly found her answer to Glenn's question and trying to get clarification from her pretty horrifying, pretty scary. And I'll play you why right now. And hats off to Glenn. I mean, I don't know if Glenn, how much he actually wants to support her or prop her up, but he has agreed that a lot of these arguments being made against her, some of her rhetoric, are in good faith. He doesn't think that they're just people trying to tear her down or smear her like I've been accused of when I brought these things up. He agrees that they are being made in good faith. And I think that needs to be remembered. There are people out there like myself, like a lot of you guys listening, who hold very strong anti-war views and who have very strong views against U.S. militarism and U.S. empire. And if we're going to be shown someone who's supposed to hold those views, and they have pro-torture rhetoric, they're conflicted on torture, they full-throatedly endorse the war on terror, those really need to be unpacked and seriously addressed. And again, I am shocked and surprised that a lot of my fellow leftists, progressives, and people on Twitter who just seem to want to defend her and not really actually have her pressed on these issues. And I find that very troubling. And to me, it illustrates a more problematic mindset on the left of this faith-based hero worship kind of thinking, where, even Glenn Greenwald, I mean, people were too afraid to criticize The Intercept or him for several years, and now it's kind of safe to, because it's kind of obvious that Piero Midyar didn't want The Intercept to talk much about Ukraine, didn't want to push much against the, regime change plans in Syria. It's pretty obvious that the Snowden cache was monetized, that there's really no real legitimate explanation for why they're closing that down with the budget they have. There's a lot of very legitimate criticism to have against The Intercept. And Piero Midyar himself, I mean, he's extremely pro-Russiagate. He now donates money to the Bulwark, which is Bill Kristol's new outlet. So, look what that hero worship did for us. It really did nothing. It kind of just set us back, and now it's like, oh yeah, Glenn Greenwald, he does actually have a lot of problems that he probably should address, or his outlet does, and now that's kind of accepted. But 2 years ago, you were basically laughed out of the room or mocked for being a hater or purity test or whatever the fuck. I mean, it's the same kind of thing with Tulsi Gabbard. So I just want people to remember that a lot of those criticisms about Greenwald ended up being completely valid and true. After it got kind of past the personalities of Mark Ames and Yasha Levine, who people tried to make it all about them, for years, and be like, oh, you guys just have a bone to pick, yada, yada. I mean, who cares if they did? Everything they said was right. Every single thing that they reported about The Intercept was right. Similar to Tor. Yasha Levine, when he first started reporting about Tor, it made a lot of people on the left and the progressive community outraged. It even pissed me off. I was ignorant enough to not realize that a lot of the things he was reporting on were very true and very crucial. Totally correct. Tor is exactly like how he described. So, I mean, that remains true. And I believe that these criticisms of Tulsi Gabbard will hold out and remain true as well. It does not appear to me that she is even trying to mold or change her rhetoric to appeal more to a morally consistent aspect of the anti-war community. To me, it seems like she is still trying to keep this wishy-washy, broad coalition-building message to appeal to people on the left and the right about anti-war, regardless of the, moral problems with doing that. And I don't know, maybe that's why she's not taking a strong position against torture. I mean, I honestly don't know. I can only speculate on that. Maybe it's because she's still in the military. That's all stuff I really don't know. I want her to answer for it. I want people like Greenwald and other of these, adversarial journalists who are kind of supporting her to really press her on these things. Otherwise, I mean, imagine what's going to happen if she gets into the debate stage. Do you really think CNN and these other outlets that are already trying to smear her aren't smart enough to be using these hypocrisies that I'm laying out now against her? I mean, that one of them is probably going to ask her about her torture stance at a debate, and she's going to fail the answer in front of an audience full of people. Unless she does something or consults with somebody, I don't know. I mean, again, the neoliberal media is sometimes very good at, doing a gotcha question on something that, comes out of left field. There are people from Media Matter, and I can't prevent this. I'm just going to say this on this broadcast, that there are people from Media Matters who follow my timeline and who have used things and tweets that I've said against right-wing figures in bad faith. They've used tweets of mine. They've used video clips I posted in bad faith. When I say in bad faith, I mean it's because Media Matters is a bullshit organization run by David Brock. It's a partisan organization. So, these people are out there paying attention to these contradictions or these things. And who knows? That video of her talking about torture, who knows how much that's circulated. But I wouldn't be surprised if during a debate, the moderator brings that video up, because that is actually something that sets her apart from almost all the other Democrats running in the primary, is her conflicted stance on torture. So let me see if there's anything else in the chat that I should address for now. Here's another interesting thing. If she's running against Trump and her goal is to actually win the primary and spar with Trump, there's quite a glaring sort of void in the rhetoric that she puts out now that's actually directed against Trump specifically. And I find that interesting as well. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because she's trying to appeal to Trump's voting base to try to siphon some of his votes. It could be that simple. I just noticed it, and I was just find it a little bit strange. It does seem to imply, along with a lot of her other statements, that she is trying to build a broad coalition at the expense of being principled and moral. And that's really as far as I can go with it. I mean, I can speculate about why else I think that she's espousing these views or why she's not espousing certain views. It would all be speculation. I mean, I really don't know. There are times to me when I've heard her talk that sound neoconservative, that sound like her views were informed by right-wing figures or think tanks, but I don't know that. I'm just going by what she's saying. So now I'm going to play for you a clip where Glenn Greenwald, I think he kind of sets her up for a softball here too. And Glenn, you know, has traditionally been very centered around the idea of blowback. Him and Scahill have been pushing this narrative for a long time that we create more terrorists because of our bombing campaigns in the Middle East, which I in a general sense, I believe is very true. I don't believe in the paradigm that we're going to create, terrorist attack in the United States by continuing to bomb other countries. Unfortunately, the consequences of our genocidal foreign policy seem to be virtually nothing in terms of like our domestic, like people doing anything here. I mean, America is just constantly bombing the Middle East and barely anything at all ever happens to us. So I don't subscribe to blowback in that way. I don't think that is a threat in that sense. I do, however, believe that we do create people who want to kill Americans and who want to do harm to Americans or the West by bombing countries into oblivion. I mean, I think that's pretty logical. If someone bombed, you, and you knew what country, and they came from a foreign country, you might want to fuck them up. I mean, you probably would. So, I mean, that to me makes perfect sense. He kind of sets up the question to get her to differentiate between being a dove on regime change wars and a hawk on the war on terror by kind of feeding her that, the blowback narrative a little bit. And she doesn't take it. She kind of doubles down, and you'll hear what I mean here. It's very interesting.
And who they want to lead their country.
So let me ask you this what one might call a paradox of your campaign, although maybe it isn't, which is that you're running as a peace candidate. You're talking about peace dividends, and yet you're kind of one of your most famous iconic quotes is, "I'm a dove on regime change wars, but a hawk when it comes to fighting terrorism." Yeah. I completely understand the dove part of the regime change war, but tell me, if you could please, the sense in which you describe yourself as a hawk. Do you support the prongs of the war on terror that haven't been about regime change, but have been things about drone assassination, even of American citizens, about Guantanamo? What is it? What is your hawkishness when it comes to the war on terror?
Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11. killing thousands of Americans. We have continued to see that threat that is posed by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is not a war that we chose, but it is a threat that continues, and we cannot just turn our backs and pretend as though it doesn't exist. So when I say that I'm a hawk on fighting against terrorism, it is against these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Our national security is important. Keeping the American people safe is the #1 job that the president has.
Okay. So this is an interesting one because I feel like a lot of the people that, call themselves left or progressive or anti-war right now, they might hear that answer and think, what's wrong with that? She's exactly right. We need to keep our country safe, from ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I'm just surprised. First of all, there really is the chances of getting attacked by a terrorist, quote unquote terrorists in this country, are still statistically lower than getting struck by lightning. So the idea that we need to do anything involving foreign policy to protect ourselves from ISIS or Al-Qaeda is obscenely illogical. It just is. Now, she doesn't actually explain how we should be fighting these people. So when Glenn Greenwald tries to get her to clarify that, because I think that's another important piece to this, is what kind of war on terror does she want to wage? Like an ideological war? Does she want to teach people different ideology or try to spread less extremist ideology? It's not clear. And you can hear Glenn Greenwald try to get her to clarify a little more here. And I'll play you the rest of the clip.
And then, so just the last question, our time is running out. If you exclude things like Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, the regime change wars that you vehemently oppose and have consistently opposed, has the U.S. government done a good job in fighting against those groups? Do you believe it should have been more belligerent and militaristic? Has it been too militaristic? What's your assessment of that part of the war that you believe requires hawkishness against the groups that attacked us on 9/11?
I don't think that the United States government has done a good job, because we find ourselves in a place today where Al-Qaeda is stronger now than they ever have been before. And you look at Syria as the foremost example. I introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act.
I cringe when I hear her talk about this. I mean, and I don't think it's an excuse or it validates it at all that she's military, that she has a military history. In fact, I actually think that makes it worse, because I think if you've gone through the military and you understand that these regime change wars are so costly and so bad, how on earth could you still subscribe this strongly to the idea that we need to somehow defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda with military force? That's always going to be the excuse. That is the excuse to do regime change. And I find it odd, too, that Glenn Greenwald can separate Afghanistan and Iraq from the war on terror, saying that, those are just regime change wars, so we know you already strongly oppose those. But why isn't there more of a nuanced discussion here about how both of those wars were sold to us as the beginning of the war on terror? That was the war. That's how the war on terror started. The war on terror didn't start with us, drone bombing or targeted assassinations on individual quote unquote terrorists. It started with full on military invasions of two separate countries. So I just don't understand that, why that's not more discussed. How we were sold Iraq based on this notion of Saddam working with Al-Qaeda, and then he was going to conduct a terrorist attack, with biological weapons. And then miraculously an anthrax attack happened in this country. 5 people died. And that's what Colin Powell used as his sort of knockout punch at the UN presentation to convince the world to go that going into Iraq was okay. I'm going to see if there's any other comments in here that I should address right now. Oh my God, I've already been going for an hour? Holy shit. I really, really rambled here. And I haven't even played any of the other clips I plan to play. Jesus Christ. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, Marlon, points out there's not a word about ending the war. She seems to believe that ISIS and Al Qaeda need to be defeated. But how? I mean, anyone could proclaim they are ISIS or Al Qaeda. There is not a central hub. I mean, this idea that Zawahiri somehow controlling all these troops. I mean, even her reference to Al Qaeda in Syria is technically inaccurate. The group that's actually operating that she's talking about in Syria is called Al-Nusra. They're an Al Qaeda loyal group. They don't take instructions from like Zawahiri or anything like that. So, I mean, even that I believe is reductive and oversimplified. And I've talked about this before, that I think the general focus about why the CIA rebel program in Syria is bad, or the Pentagon rebel program in Syria is bad, is because we're quote unquote funding terrorists. I mean, yes, that's a sensationalist way to get the public to be like, oh my God, we're funding terrorists? Like, why are we doing this? We're supposed to be fighting terrorists. I understand why people use the rhetoric, but when it becomes the primary dominating narrative of why the Syrian regime change operation is bad, I do believe that it does veer into sort of right-baited Islamophobia territory. And I'll explain a little bit why. Because, I mean, frankly, anybody being paid by the CIA and the Pentagon, even if they're the most liberal person in the world who's picking up arms to fight Assad, who's being paid by the U.S. government, to me should be looked at as an equally bad thing as someone who is a fundamentalist Islamic radical being paid by the U.S. government to pick up arms against another country. I don't frankly give a fuck what religious views they hold. If they're being paid to overthrow the regime of another country by the U.S. government, it's all bad to me. It's all destructive and harmful, and it shouldn't be done. So I do think it's kind of a distraction and reductive and designed to really kind of catch the attention of certain people in this country by making it all about us, quote unquote, funding terrorists. I just think that's wrong. I also believe that the word terrorist in general, since 9/11 and since the brainwashing we've been put through by the Bush administration, should be decoupled and separated as often as possible from Muslims or the Islamic religion or Arabs. I think that it's frankly disgusting that people throw around the term terrorism so freely when it comes to the Muslim world, but so hesitant with other things. Either we use it in a consistent way to describe all terrorist acts or all people that commit violent, heinous acts designed to shock and awe people, or we don't use it at all. And I think that most of the time, 99% of the time, even on the left, it is used selectively. And it really, really bugs me. And I really do think if your goal here is similar to mine, to undermine the logic of the war on terror, to undermine the whole framework and this paradigm of needing to fight terrorists or defeat a tactic, I mean, what kind of bullshit is that? Then you should also want to decouple the word terrorism from the Islamic world or Muslims in general. And this idea that she's so proud of her Stop Funding Terrorists Act, why even call it that? Is she just trying to catch the attention of the right wing? Why call it Stop Funding Terror? Why not just call it Stop Funding a Proxy War Act? I don't get it, and I have a problem with it. See if there's any other comments. Ami says, I notice he's been dodging you. You're not talking about me, are you? John, if you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it. Oh, no, I don't think he's talking about me. He's talking about someone else. Yeah, and Marlon Edinger says it great. Why is religious violence somehow worse than non-religious violence? Great question. There's a particular, and I will believe this is for as long as I live, that there's a particular fixation on Islamic terrorism, not just because of the 9/11 attacks and the way we were brainwashed, just in regards to the fear that generated, but also because there was very little risk to dehumanizing an entire civilization of people, entire race of people after 9/11. I mean, even now, it's like the least risky form of racism to openly express. And that's really disgusting to me. And if you're sort of okay with perpetuating that, I just don't agree with what you're doing. And I do think it's really important to even break this down about why does it matter? I mean, and it's interesting to me too, because a lot of the people who jump on that narrative about how, the worst part of Syrian regime change is that we're quote unquote funding terrorists, they don't like go back to 9/11, pre 9/11 history and also explain, well, then who was funding the Al-Qaeda people who did the 9/11 attacks? And the farthest they'll go with that is, it was Saudi Arabia. Oh, really? It was Saudi Arabia? You mean the same country that had business relationships with the Bush family? And additionally, the bin Laden family was also in business with the Bush family? I mean, so this it's interesting to me that a lot of the people who espouse this rhetoric about Syria, they don't even go as far as breaking down 9/11 and like what that means. So I find it just odd. And let's see what else is being said in the chat. Yeah, and you also hear this rhetoric from Tulsi sometimes about how these Christians are being persecuted in Syria, and they shouldn't be, and how we need to protect them. And a lot of right-wingers, like to hoist that out, even though the Yazidis were actually the main real group targeted in Syria at the very beginning, who aren't Christian. They're like a very obscure religious sect that were targeted by ISIS. That the U.S. used as a prop to get us to be okay with bombing ISIS in the first place. Even though they were a real group, they were actually being persecuted. They weren't technically Christians. But yet, the right wing and people like Tulsi Gabbard have sort of turned this narrative into like a seemingly real thing, that Christians are under all this threat in Syria. We need to protect the Christians. Christians are being beheaded. Well, what about Muslims in Syria who don't subscribe to ISIS? I mean, do you think that none of them exist and that none of them are being persecuted? I mean, it's interesting to me that it's just all about how we need to save the Christians, but yet, I mean, think of how many people who are Muslim or Islamic in Syria who are deathly afraid of groups like ISIS. I mean, there's a difference between what ISIS believes and what a lot of, practicing Muslims believe. But yet, right-wingers like Sam Harris and a lot of these other people have kind of put it into our brains that actually there's really not that much of a difference. And if you poll Muslims, I mean, the majority of them actually, are sympathetic to ISIS or whatever. So I believe that there is, a general bigotry sort of fueling some of this rhetoric. And that's still going to be a problem for me moving forward when I'm seen, left narratives about Syria, or libertarian narratives about Syria. Symbolic Recording says she has never anything to say about military conduct in these wars. That's a valid point. And I would like to be proven wrong on that. I would like somebody to share a video clip with me, put it in the chat now, share anything where she talks about specifically the damage that our military causes in foreign countries through bombing, through just occupation, like being an invader in someone's country. I haven't heard her talk about that. I've spoken to a lot of veterans who that is the primary thing. I mean, other than seeing dead bodies or experiencing death at the hands of their fellow soldiers and seeing corpses and knowing that they've caused this fucking carnage in another country, one of the main things you'll hear from veterans is how awful they feel being like invaders and occupying someone's country. And then when that realization sets in, then, oh my God, if someone did this to my home, I would be outraged. I mean, that mentality is something that I don't hear from her at all. And again, please prove me wrong on this. Please send me video clips or anything about her having sort of this about-face moment of what it was like to be an occupier and how she feels about that now. Faint Signals from Vegas says, Tulsi Gabbard only in recent months just started mentioning the carnage in the Middle East. She used to only talk about soldiers' deaths. I've heard her talk very strongly about the genocide in Yemen, starvation, the amount of deaths in Yemen and all the carnage we're causing over there. She mostly, however, though, blames it on Saudi Arabia, even though the U.S. is actually directly involved in that conflict as well. We are bombing Yemen. But I haven't heard her talk about that in regards to Iraq and even Afghanistan, two of these so-called regime change wars. So even in regards to the regime change wars she believes need to be strongly opposed, I have yet to hear rhetoric like that from her about those two wars. So I'm waiting. If someone wants to send me a video, soundbite, even a printed interview where she talks about that, I would happily play it here. But I'm probably only going to be doing this for the next 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to go through just some other clips here. This is something that she really seems to have no problem saying, and she's kind of proud of it. When she's asked sort of why she's serving, like what's her inspiration, she will, she still it's interesting because as someone who served in the military as a response to 9/11, who enlisted, for someone being so opposed to regime change wars, she still seems to believe that it was perfectly valid for her to sign up for the military to fight terrorism as a response to 9/11. And I'll play you the clip here. This is from Jordan Chariton's interview, February 24th, 2019.
Bribes. There's ballot measures that pass by the will of the voters pass it. They're overturned. I mean, the list goes on. Is the country you see now different than the one you thought entering the war?
I enlisted after 9/11, like so many Americans, because I wanted to do something to serve and protect our country, especially after Al-Qaeda attacked us and killed thousands of Americans on that day. I love our country. I love our people. It's why I continue to serve in the Army National Guard now for almost 15 years. And it's what motivates me to run for president, frankly. It's what motivates me every single day because each of us has a responsibility to help carry out the vision and the ideals and the principles upon which our country was founded. Clearly, there are many examples of how, unfortunately, we have gotten off track. But this is where, as we care for each other as people, as we as we love our country, this motivates us further. This motivates me further to do all I can.
I just find that interesting that Jordan's question was basically, now that the country is like so fucked up, do you feel the same way about like serving in the military, like for this country and believing in it? And she essentially says, yeah, she believes in it more than ever. And she doubles down again on why she signed up for the military, to fight terrorists, to fight Al-Qaeda, and how that we were attacked on 9/11. Let me play some more clips here. Here's a clip of her curiously omitting, in my opinion, the cost of war against the people that we are waging the wars against, and instead a focus on American lives, not people in those countries. This is from her interview with Jordan Chariton.
Dictators.
That's right. Well, as a soldier, as you mentioned, I served in a medical unit during my first deployment to Iraq, where every single day I was confronted with the heart-wrenching high human cost of war. The cost of war and the toll that it takes on our troops and on our veterans. What to speak of the lives of the people in these countries where we wage these regime change wars. Knowing and experiencing and understanding the high cost of war personally is why I'm so committed to fighting for peace and bringing about an end to these regime change wars.
So it's actually incorrect. She does kind of mention at the end that she like kind of throws it in there that the people in these countries who are suffering. It seems though it's kind of an aside. I mean, she definitely prefers to talk about the cost to our soldiers and American lives, which is fine. I mean, I can understand why a politician is going to focus on that more. But I am surprised how little she mentions the actual damage that our violence inflicts on those countries and those people. She is interested in mentioning the damage that destabilizing their country causes and the suffering that as a result of that. She does seem to kind of dance around or not like to talk about the direct suffering as a result of our military munitions and troop presence and soldiers killing people. And I find that interesting. I mean, it's careful of her to not do that. I mean, to me, it seems unnatural. Coming from the world of anti-war activism, anti-imperialism, even hearing people like Ron Paul talk years and years ago, who I believe Ron Paul was kind of informed by rhetoric from the anti-war left, it seems unnatural to me to sort of skip over that and focus more on the American cost and kind of loosely describe how people suffer from our destabilization attempts. I find it unnatural. And I feel like it's deliberate on her part. And I feel that she's doing it to try to broadly appeal, to a larger voting base, perhaps, by not mentioning, Americans don't want to know that their tax dollars murder people, turn people into hamburger patties for no reason whatsoever, turn children into hamburger patties from the sky. I mean, that's not something that voters want to hear about. They'd rather hear about how it's taking money from their pocketbooks and, it's giving it to those goddamn foreigners to help their country. I mean, that's kind of, sadly, I believe that that's what she's trying to broadly appeal to. And again, I could be wrong. I don't know exactly why has such an unnatural sounding response to war and the moral implications of war. But that's my guess. And yeah, John Gold brought up an interesting point. Bush was against, quote, regime change wars as well during his campaign. He actually made it a plank of his campaign to say no nation building. He said it multiple times. There's a reason why certain political candidates use this rhetoric and use it in a very broad and an unspecific way. Because once you start to go too far down the rabbit hole of talking about the moral implications of war, you start turning people off. You start making people think too much about, wow, oh my God, you mean like I'm an appendage of a massive serial killer genocidal force that's just obliterating human beings across the world for no reason every day, mostly Muslim people. I mean, it's hard for that to, I think, to sink in for most people. And I think she realizes that on some level, maybe. But again, I mean, it almost sounds like excuse making that I'm doing that. She's just doing this for politicking. I mean, to me, on some level, it does also seem like she really does believe in the war on terror. She really does believe in it. And she really doesn't think a whole lot about the suffering that American military has directly inflicted on these other countries. That's my sense of it. And I could be wrong. I'm willing to be proven wrong. Michael Tracy said that she has, I'll actually read his quote, because this is kind of what spurred this webcast. Michael Tracy said, she expressly and repeatedly talks about the moral cost incurred on the people in foreign lands due to U.S. policy. I personally witnessed her talking about this on multiple occasions. Maybe you should stop misrepresenting her views. Well, it's interesting that Michael's response is that, because I don't think Michael understood my original tweet, which wasn't about the general cost incurred on the people in foreign lands due to U.S. foreign policy. I'm talking about the idea that it's wrong to murder people in foreign countries with the U.S. military for the purposes of defeating terrorists or regime change. And apparently Michael didn't understand that, and he wanted to kind of straw man my position, which is fine. I mean, he's kind of in the bag for Tulsi, which, I think as if he wants to basically be an adversarial journalist and he's getting the opportunity to interview her in these sit-down interviews, he's doing a disservice by actually, not really addressing the real concerns with her, and kind of dodging these things. I mean, I've actually tried to get him to respond on several issues repeatedly on this, and I don't think any of his answers are adequate at all. I mean, his best answer that he's been able to give is, well, she's kind of from a military background. The way she talks and looks at the world, is kind of informed by her military views. You can't expect her to have this kind of like pacifist left view. I mean, if that's the best excuse, I mean, that's okay. But it still doesn't explain really a lot of things, because as I was saying, I mean, Mike Preisner, who served in Iraq, is Abby's co-producer on Empire Files, and you should hear him talk about war. I mean, it's a hell of a lot fucking stronger than Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, he talks about the horrible things that soldiers did to Iraqis constantly. And it's strange that she can't talk about any of those things. I mean, even Ron Paul, if you remember correctly, he was asked during a debate, why do they hate us? Like, why did they do 9/11 or whatever? Like, I don't remember the exact question, but he just repeated what bin Laden said. He's like, oh, here's why. Like, because we were on the Arabian Peninsula, we were occupying, because of the Gulf War and et cetera, et cetera. I don't even think Tulsi Gabbard could say something that strongly. So I don't know. I mean, let's get into some more. I guess I'm just going to keep going until this is done, because I wrote down a bunch of notes to kind of, and I'm telling you, I really did look for strong moral positions that she was taking on war, explaining why bombing is wrong, even collateral damage in the war on terror in a general sense. I couldn't find a single clip or statement for her in that regard. And I'm begging you people, please send me something, because everyone, seemingly, most people I'm arguing with, or most people that I'm getting responses from, saying I'm misrepresenting her views. I'm not watching what she's saying. I'm ignoring all her statements. And I'm really trying here to make sure I'm giving her a fair shake and to look at all the recent interview clips she's done. And I am not finding that I am misrepresenting her views at all. I'm not finding that I'm ignoring things she's saying or omitting things. I'm desperately trying to find right now statements that she's making in the regards to what I'm saying, and I can't find them. So again, please post something now. Probably be doing this for maybe another 20 minutes. So if you find something to rebut what I'm trying to say about her, please put it in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to play some other clips from this Jordan Sheraton interview that she did. And just in that last clip I played, I mean, I want to emphasize that she makes sure to say regime change wars instead of just wars. She makes a clear distinction between the war on terror and regime change wars, but not really necessarily explaining why. And that's also important, I feel like, because as I was saying earlier, you can't historically decouple or remove Iraq and Afghanistan from the war on terror narrative. That's how they were sold to us. That was the launching of the war on terror. They are inseparable from the idea of regime change wars. There was never a distinction made between the two. I mean, the Obama administration tried to make a distinction, but it was bullshit. So, again, I find that interesting that that's accepted among so many progressive, that there's this one track, oh, no, we completely oppose that. But no, the war on terror over here, yeah, you can't, that's too crazy to expect a politician to disagree with that. I mean, that's kind of the mentality that I'm being faced with, is that it's like too tall of an order for an anti-war politician to say anything against the war on terror. I just find that unacceptable. For some reason, people want me to talk about AOC. I mean, I think she's terrible on foreign policy. She's very cowardly on really crucial positions. And I also find it suspicious that she's being boosted by the mainstream media to the degree that she is. So I'm not really a fan of anybody. I guess I'm not a fan of any politician, especially Republican or Democrat right now. I mean, I really am not. And I think just doing the work that I do, I mean, I think it's actually better that I don't get behind any of these politicians and then I criticize these people. Because especially someone like Tulsi Gabbard, where else are you going to find good faith, strong anti-war arguments assessing her foreign policy credentials? It seems like everybody else on the left and all these other progressives want to just have a tea party with her, because she says things they like to hear. At first, that's what I thought. I thought she was saying all these great things that I like to hear. And then I started paying more attention to her. And I started to think, wow, this is really problematic in a lot of ways. If this is going to be the main anti-war narrative, anti-war debate moving forward, and she's going to take a lot of this public space up and push this forward to the public, I feel that it is actually setting back, in a lot of ways, the fundamental goal here, which would be to undermine the war on terror and these perpetual wars. Because we're essentially allowing this narrative to be like, oh yeah, that's strong enough for us. We like that enough. There's no one better than her, so let's just full-throatedly defend everything she says. I mean, that is actually really dumb. And I think it's intellectually dishonest. And I think that we're in such a bad way with the U.S. empire and these perpetual wars that it's really important to push back against that. Really, really important. I just got an important phone call, so I'm going to have to end this early. Sorry, guys. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. And if you want to support anything I'm doing, you can do it at patreon.com/MediaRootsRadio for now, until I start my own Patreon. So thanks, guys. Take care.